Gentlemen, I've brought you here to discuss the Eastwood problem.
It may be necessary to penetrate the Vinny Eastwood show.
The Vinny Eastwood show.
Yeah, that's what I said.
Oh, I've been working on a new Vinny scene. I think that might be the kind of penetration we need. The Vinny Eastwood show. Sundays, 3 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. Live on Ground Zero Radio.
Welcome, ladies, gentlemen, and hermaphrodites. My fellow slaves of the global plantation. The Vinny Eastwood show is bad news. It's like the news, but so much worse. It's the lighter side of genocide. Just because we're being exterminated doesn't mean we can't enjoy it. Otherwise, what's the point of being killed? The Vinny Eastwood show, where the only thing worse than living in a high-tech global police state run by child trafficking satanists is Vinny's jokes.
And welcome, ladies, gentlemen, and hermaphrodites, to another exciting episode of the Vinny Eastwood Show, broadcasting live on Ground Zero Radio out of the United States, that are now enjoying a new president-elect who is, of course, going to keep all his election promises and not put you into lockdowns like he did last time, right? You know, it's just the investment in authority that people have, as if the establishment would allow a member of the establishment to save you from them, is relatively unreasonable, if I was to try and put it extraordinarily politely. So, today, the Vinny Eastwood Show has a very special guest indeed, one of a number of former employees of the government's enforcement arm who have basically turncoated, you know, the kind of things like, you know what, I really don't like being part of the meat grinding machine. I'd rather be flambeing the meat grinders themselves. You know, it's something that happens on occasion, very rarely, where you will be working in an industry, and government is an industry, mind you, ladies and gentlemen, so is organised crime, and I can't fit a cigarette paper between them, and they decide that no, I'm not going to do that anymore. I'm going to have a look at some of the systemic problems that are actually happening in my country to my people, and I'm going to do something about it, and I'm going to try and expose it the best way I know how. Our very special guest is the wonderful and magnanimous Kerry Grass. Kerry, welcome to the program.
You're quite a comedian, aren't you? Yeah, I mean, I contacted you directly because I have seen some of your previous interviews, and I think you've got a good interviewing style. And you touch into those areas that the mainstream media don't normally tap into because they might lose their job. But I just want to sort of give my disclaimer that I've heard some of your advertisements, and I don't actually necessarily take your opinion on them on the comedy side. So I just want to make that clear that I respect you as an interviewer, but me coming onto your show doesn't mean that I am endorsing everything that you've done on your show, if that's okay.
Okay. Well, I wouldn't expect anybody to, frankly, because there's so many different people on the show that if you were to endorse all of them, that would be tantamount to insanity or schizophrenia, if you want to define it more specifically. But yes, each episode is a standalone episode. Everybody speaks for themselves. I speak for myself, and I don't really speak for anybody else. It's just a conversation. It's coming from the Latin con, meaning together, just like chili con carne, which is chili with meat. A verse, which you would have in a song. It's basically singing together. We're just a little chorus here, darling, and it's going to be back and forth in an in an entertaining and friendly and fun manner. The reason why the show is conducted in this manner specifically is because the vast majority of the people that we have on this broadcast are traumatized in some way, shape or form, usually between 1 and 6 months, where they didn't have complete control of their life, and as a result suffer from complex post-traumatic stress, which means that they have an overactive imagination in terms of their reptilian cortex, which governs their fight and flight. That means, that moment when a car just swerves in front of you on the highway and you have to just jam on the brakes in order to, and then your nervous system takes a little while to calm down. Having complex post-traumatic stress is like that while you're making a cup of tea. So as long as everybody's comfortable to be themselves and relaxed, that they're not going to be judged, you can get the most out of them. And it can wind up being very therapeutic, not only for the person being interviewed, but for the audience themselves, who usually also suffer from such a condition. This is why they get here. Somebody called me the conspiracy therapist.
I like that.
I liked it too, and so I stole it, and I'm going to continue to use it.
And you're free. $1,000 an hour.
Yes, well, the whole thing about being funny, somebody will tell me that you're pretty funny, and the whole idea of it is godliness. All right, God has a sense of humor. That's why He created weed and prohibitionists. All right, this.
And 10 commandments.
Yeah, 10 commandments and only 7 sins. So there's some incongruence. I just had a realization the other day, just a little bit off topic. I know a lot of very deeply Christian friends. Billy TK is one of them, and a thought occurred to me. You say that the Bible's the Word of God. Okay, that's great. But do you really think that in ancient Judea, in the Middle East, you had people walking around called Daniel, John, and Paul, and Thomas? I don't think so. Okay, I really don't think so. I'm pretty sure that those names have been anglicized, and then the thing has been turned into propaganda so that you can control people, which is basically what happens with every good bit of information, really. Somebody will take the inspiration for it.
You're going off track there, Vinny.
I understand.
You're going off track there. I haven't run to speak about God, although I am a believer.
Yeah.
Let's move on, shall we?
Yes. Well, anyway, nevertheless, the point was that it doesn't matter where you draw your inspiration from, somebody will always try to take it away from you. And the point is to make sure that you take all those little nuggets of hope and freedom and loveliness and godliness and take it. And it doesn't matter. You have to then give that energy back. That is how we serve God. We get given gifts by God, and then we give them back to mankind in service. Right? At least that's my opinion on it. So, Kerry, without, as they say in Palestine, further ado, would you be able to just tell us a little bit about you and what it is you do?
What it is I do? Well, I was a public servant at the young age of 17. I've had a lot of my working life with public service in New Zealand, also in Australia and the United Kingdom. And the overseas experience in Australia and the UK was for about 5 years. And it was between the years of 2005 and 2003. Oh gosh, I'm not very good at maths. And when did I go to Australia? I went to Australia end of 2003. And I came back to New Zealand at the beginning of 2009. And during that time, I was, working for governments as well as the banking industry. I work in the area of financial crime. I formerly was a police officer in New Zealand. I joined the police as a sworn police officer in 1993 when I was 23. And I was there for between 7 and 8 years. which was a great job. But I left just as methamphetamine was coming in. So policing today is quite different to the times that I did it. But I have always had an interest in justice. And after being overseas and coming back to New Zealand and, working in the area of financial crime, which is a lot about governance, governance, controls, policy, oversight, monitoring, reporting. And if it's not there, then you're not governing. Since I've been back in New Zealand, around 2010, I sort of started looking at New Zealand's systems for governance of financial crime. And the more I looked, the more horrific it became. Okay, that might be an exaggeration, but I mean...
No, you're actually underselling it, because that's... Yeah, so sorry, go ahead.
Well, yeah, I mean, I found basic systems broken, literally broken, areas of top security in New Zealand. And I'm not here to pinpoint or, to finger point those government departments. But New Zealand is in a very bad way when it comes to dealing with organised crime. If you look at our structure, we have I see you've got behind you description of the police force, and I support the police. Every community needs a police force, and every police force needs a community, but they have to be in partnership. And not that I actually did research that terminology called policing by consent, but as a former police officer, I understand it. I mean, I'm 5'4", and as a police officer wearing a uniform, if I go to arrest somebody who's 10'6", maybe this might be an exaggeration, but you get my point. Say, let's 6'4" or 6'6" and built like a tower. Really, in the end, that's sort of going to be policing by consent. Otherwise, someone's going to end up with bruises, and I don't think it's going to be the person I'm trying to arrest. You see, so
the key here is trust. Like the
respect.
Trust and respect, essentially. And common practice for the New Zealand police, or at least according to almost every single person that I've spoken to who's ever been on the wrong side of the law, quote unquote, having any trust in the police and getting any respect from them, it just doesn't happen, or it's a very bad idea in the first place, kind of thing. And it gave rise to the belief, I believe I had, what was her name? Grace Hayden, former prosecuting sergeant of the New Zealand Auckland Central Police. And she said that the New Zealand police are so corrupt that you will either become corrupted by them or you will leave. And this is why I'm glad that you've left, Kerry. Now,
wasn't the reason I left, but I don't need to comment on that.
Indeed. What's his name? Mark Passio is a very, very ardent, anarchist kind of thing. And he's of the... not of the opinion, he claims this to be a fact, that technically there are no good police officers. And he qualifies this with the thing that if you're part of a system that routinely lies to people, ruins their lives, destroys their private property, kidnaps them, tortures them, so on and so forth, regardless if you are actually personally accountable for it, what you don't do, generally speaking, if you're part of those organizations, is turn whistleblower while you're part of them and expose the things that are being done to human beings in an inhuman way while you're part of that organization. Bad people let bad things happen. They're not just the people who do the bad things. Therefore, logically speaking, every police officer, by hook or by crook, if you'll pardon the pun, is a bad person.
No. Well, can I respond to that? I'll break it down a little bit. A lot of police officers, if they see wrongdoing, they will take action. And it's when they take action that, things the path will open up in front of them. Either they'll be supported by management or they won't. And if they're not supported by management, then things can become difficult. But, let's just go to the situation of governance. So if you look at the policing structure, and if we agree that every police force needs a community and every community needs a police force, and it's a partnership relationship, hand in hand like it used to be, community policing.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but just a technicality on this is that there's a difference between a policeman and a policewoman and a police officer. One is a corporate enforcement officer, just like a CEO is a chief executive officer, and one of them is meant to keep peace within the community. That's called policing, but the other is meant to act as a corporate agent for the state. That's what we call police officers, just on the technical definition there. So anyway, sorry, Kerry, go right ahead.
Well, if you look at the Policing Act, allows the police commissioner to pass instructions, instructions referred to as general instructions, and they are the policy and the procedures and the practice that all police officers need to follow. So a police officer is a police officer, and the obligation that they have is, yes, they're a public servant, but they also are obligated by oath to carry out their, procedures and decision making without malice or ill will, and they can't go breaching any laws. But if I can just go back, they're there to protect the public, so they can't obviously go breaching any laws that an ordinary public person cannot do. So when they use force, it has to be judged in the same way that you would judge anyone under, the Crimes Act, say. Look at the circumstances. Now, that's where I want to focus on this word governance, because this need to have trust in the police means that when things do go awry between the police and the public, a member of the public or members, there needs to be a true independency of dealing with that issue. Now, I think New Zealand history shows the public have never had real confidence in the Independent Police Conduct Authority. And just on that point, I just want to give a contribution to a person in New Zealand, Shannon Parker, and she identified problems in the independence governance structure of the New Zealand Police about 15 years ago, and she took it upon herself to work voluntary, and she's done some amazing, wonderful things pretty much single-handedly, and has had some great wins in court that the police had turned the file downside on, took no further action, and then Shannon sort of acts as an intermediary between complainants and the Independent Police Conduct Authority. But given that she's been so successful, that alone is an indication that our Independent Police Conduct Authority is still continuing to fail. They're still continuing to fail. There has been judicial inquiries, there's been recommendations after recommendations after recommendations, and it all comes down to the governance structure. Sometimes governance structures fail, and it's very transparent, the reasons why. And, I just on this point, this actually wasn't the reason why, you and I had agreed to talk. We're sort of focusing on the police, which is not really how I intended to, but it is a relevant topic because New Zealand's structure is predominantly law enforcement in the New Zealand Police, and that's across the corporate world, out in the public. They can't be all things, and but what they must have is they must have a trust relationship and partnership with the public, and therefore, the IPCA needs to have further governance controls. Their structure is set up to fail, and just on one final point on that topic is about independency. Is you probably can recall a fatal police shooting of Stephen Wallace back in Waitara. I think it happened in 2006, and his mother Raywin was one of the family members who was a public profile, and she was pushing for justice about the actual fatal police shooting, and she has been taking that case on. I think it's about 20 years or so now, or close to it. And the latest court hearing, I think it was in 2021, at the High Court, and the High Court confirmed it was not possible for the police to consider themselves an independent body when they themselves are investigating crimes that their officers have committed. So in a fatal police shooting, which was the matter that the High Court judge was hearing, she referred to international standards and, public perception, the need for public accountability. And the judge confirmed that it's not possible for the police to comply with international standards and expectations and be involved in conducting their own police fatal shootings. Now, I haven't seen anything in the media or any comment by the police commissioner or any comment by the state services commissioner or whoever those structured bodies are to show that New Zealand is now complying with international standards in that regard for fatal police shootings.
It's if I created an organisation that was called the IVCA, the Independent Vinny Conduct Authority, all right, and now anybody who's got a problem with Vinny, they take their complaints to Vinny, and Vinny will investigate himself and, of course, find himself not guilty. Because that's how it works with the Independent Police Conduct Authority, because every single person who works for it is a member of the New Zealand Police.
Well, not quite, but that has been is a significant part of the issue. The public have found, and the public inquiry found, that there is a lot of former police officers that do go into the IPCA. The chair of the IPCA is a former judge. But just in regards to the independency, what happens ordinarily for an IPCA investigation is that they refer the matter back to the police to investigate. So the IPCA are there doing the paperwork, but the actual hardcore investigation for a fatal police shooting, they're not there. Now, I've been to at least one scene of a fatal police shooting. This was in, when was this? This was in 2010, beginning of 2011. I just can't quite remember the time now, but it was a young fella who was a Māori boy. He had been shot and killed, and this is up in Napier, Hastings Way, I believe it was. The initial news report said that he had fired a shotgun at the police. And at that time, I was travelling up to the North Island and from the South Island, and my thoughts were, well, if someone's going to fire a weapon at the police, there's only going to really be one outcome, and it's so sad that it happened. But then in the next follow-up news bulletin, it said that the police said no, that he hadn't fired the shotgun. And I was thinking, now how can the police, a commissioner of police, or commissioned officer, sorry, how can a commissioned officer who was giving the media broadcast give that information, have it so strongly wrong in such a crucial area? And that matter went on for years, and it still sits there today unresolved. That I won't go into that detail. But when I went to that scene, because I was travelling on my way up to the North Island, and I spoke to witnesses who were there, and they heard it all, and one of them had even seen it happening, and they hadn't been spoken to anybody by the IPCA or the police, and one of them, had actually told me what they did see, which really concerned me to the point, what did I do? I rang the IPCA and says, oh, look, I think you better dot your I's and cross your T's on that one, because what I've heard is really concerning. And, there's me trying to do my good deed as a public person, and it just went nowhere. And that's just one injustice that still sits there today in this country. But the problem with New Zealand is that we don't have an anti-corruption agency. Mm-hmm. We have the Serious Fraud Office. The Serious Fraud Office, at the time that they were given the label of including anti-corruption in their portfolio, they were only investigating about no more than 5% of complaints received. So adding anti-corruption to their portfolio did nothing, and that's the problem with New Zealand. And we're not dealing with corruption. We're ignoring it, and therefore it's getting worse. And the democracy of the country is reducing significantly, and that's an area that I'm wanting to focus on.
You've highlighted a really important issue there, because this is something Penny Bright, famed 40-year activist, harped on and on and on about, is the fact that we have no independent commission against corruption in New Zealand. And how it works is quite interesting. So, number one, if you are a corrupt politician, let's just say theoretically, and you do something corrupt for the benefit of a corporation, you can then go and immediately work for that corporation within a day or two after leaving Parliament. Whereas in Australia, there is a 6-month kind of ban on you joining corporations or something like that after leaving Parliament or something. In New Zealand, none of that. So what you can do in New Zealand is what former Justice Minister Simon Powers did during the national government, is that they put basically a company, probably the largest freehold finance company in New Zealand, run by a man named Mr. Alan Hubbard, into investigation from the Serious Fraud Office, based upon a claim that they had not issued a prospectus that year. But this is a company that doesn't issue prospectuses. And so what they did is they took this company into statutory management, broke up all the assets, sold them off. Somehow, despite the public being told that this was a Mr. Magoo operator and blah, 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 they managed to somehow return 95% of investors' money. The prime beneficiary of those receivership sales was Westpac Bank. And then Simon Power left Parliament in the middle of his term as Justice Minister to go become the head of Westpac Corporate Banking.
Yeah, that's a good point. I actually was involved personally in assisting Mr. Hubbard and the Hubbard Support Group. As a former investigator in the corporate securities market, I voluntarily offered my services at that time. That's a case where let's sort of define corruption for this conversation. I'm going to define it as an abuse of power. Could be for personal gain, but for a politician, it doesn't necessarily have to be for personal gain. It could be for some other gain of another individual. But let's just call it for this conversation abuse of power. And let's talk about Mr. Power. You're quite right. He left his position as Minister of Justice, Minister of Commerce, and he went straight into private Westpac banking, which is the government's bank, and where they do most of their banking. And then, you have John Key, the former Prime Minister, who leaves and he goes into another bank, the primary bank, Yeah. So that's an area that, is unregulated in New Zealand.
Just one note there, just on the former Prime Minister, John Key. While he was in charge of this country, he had shares in the Bank of America, and New Zealand was taking on massive loans in part from that bank. So he actually personally profited from New Zealand's growing indebtedness. But yes, continue.
Thank you, Vinny. I'm pleased you have knowledge. You have good knowledge by listening to your introduction there about the Alan Hubbard matter. So, because I investigated that, I have a lot of additional knowledge that's not known publicly, and let me share some of that with you. Keeping on this foundation of abuse of power and corruption in New Zealand politics is, Simon Power at the time when he was Minister of Commerce. And also he had the hat as Minister of Justice. He held a press conference and he presented a document to the media that were present, and he called it a fact sheet, FACT sheet. And he handed that out, and that was a sheet that had a significant evidential error in it, in that it showed he had shown funds flowing from Aorangi Securities to Alan Hubbard and his wife Jean. He had the arrows of that fund flow pointing the wrong direction. The evidence showed that Alan Hubbard and his wife Jean were actually putting money into Aorangi Securities. They were topping up, the financial stability of Aorangi. And the reason they were doing that at the time was because they were instructed to get a prospectus. My position has always been Aorangi Securities did not require a prospectus because by law the investors were habitual investors or were friends or associates of Mr. Hubbard's. And that was the definition that allowed Aorangi Securities to be a private securities company and not have a public prospectus. But just going back to that press release, the Serious Fraud Office had not commenced any investigation at that time, and Alan Hubbard had not been told of any investigation at that time. And at the time, the Minister of Justice handed out this fact sheet, that he called it a fact sheet. He had fatal errors in there as far as what he was alleging, as far as the funds flow. But the Minister of Justice, at the same time, simultaneously was breaching the Bill of Rights of Alan Hubbard and Jean Hubbard, because she was another accused person who was meant to be fraudulent. Elderly people in their 80s, he had given so much to the community, but he had breached their Bill of Rights to the natural course of justice. And the natural course of justice is always going to be inside the four walls of a court, where, the rules of justice are applied and everyone gets their chance to speak. But in New Zealand, we use the media. The media causes a lot of harm in this country. Look at Scott Watson. That's a person who, it's ridiculous that he's still behind bars. But if that was another matter that I was involved in investigating after I left the police. And in a small way, I was involved. But that was, people refer to a troll by media. And that's what it was. It was ridiculous. And the police were feeding the media, and the media were the mainstream media, and they were regurgitating what the police fed them. Same thing with the Alan Hubbard matter. The government were feeding the mainstream media their information, and all the media were doing were regurgitating it. They weren't investigating. There's no real proper investigative journalists in this country. Most of them have conflicts of interest in that they're employed by the government or connection to it,
Well, principally
What's that?
what was it, back in the day, we had something along the lines of about 3,000 investigative journalists or something thereabouts working in New Zealand during the mid-90s. By the early 2000s, New Zealand Herald, at the time the largest circulating newspaper in New Zealand, had reduced their number of investigative journalists on staff to 0. As in, there isn't actually anybody qualified, and just to define for the audience, what is an investigative journalist? Okay.
You've got to have integrity.
No, it's not necessarily just about integrity. It's about the one skill of determining a fact, right? There's a lot of people out there in this world who say that, it's impossible to tell what's a fact and what's a lie and stuff like that. It's like, no, it isn't.
They're not investigated then, are they?
No, it isn't. It's very straightforward. Okay, imagine, for example, I'm holding a drink bottle in front of you. How do you know that this drink bottle is a three-dimensional object? Because it's got 6 dimensions: top, down, left, right, front,
Well, you
and
could say,
back.
how do you know what's inside it to make it easier?
Well,
to prove?
regardless, the point is, a three-dimensional object has 6 dimensions. So does the truth. But instead of up, down, left, right, front, and back, it's who, what, when, where, how, and why. Once you have the answers to those questions, you can then qualify what you have investigated as being factual. And more specifically, there's one qualifier on top of that process of getting those 6 dimensions lined up so that you've got a solid object to report on. And then the next process is to find people who can corroborate that story who have nothing to do with each other. Okay, and once you've got 3 people...
Conflict of interest.
If you've got 3 people who have no connection with each other, all telling the same story, all telling the exact same who, what, when, where, why, and how, then, as a qualified investigator, you are then capable of going out and reporting that stuff publicly because you're fairly certain. All right, and certainty, like in science, is not exactly a small word. But you can be basically certain that what you're telling is the truth and that you're not misleading people. So, of course, if you've got 0 investigative journalists employed and what you're doing is publishing quote-unquote news, you are no longer a news organization. You are now a propaganda organization.
Yeah, I mean, any investigation, if you're going to try and narrow it down, evidentially it's subjective or objective. And objective is what you really want to be able to achieve so that an ordinary prudent person is going to be able to follow it. But, subjectivity, that's where, it's not really great evidence. The good aspects of fraud type crimes is that there's a lot of evidence, electronic, paper, and in regards to the Alan Hubbard matter, I've got the evidence personally, and I'm not the only one. There's very few people in this country who actually know the full story of this situation. But as far as the evidence, I won't say who I've got the evidence against. It's basically a very senior politician, but I would be able to be very comfortable that they would be convicted of, if not corruption, of fraud. And, I tried to have that matter dealt with properly in New Zealand, and found the same situation that I found, that 15 years ago. New Zealand doesn't have any governance systems. The Auditor General's office said I should take it to the police. Really? I don't think so. Not when it's, a very senior former politician. And I've still got that. The good thing about evidence, it doesn't go anywhere. It's sitting there. And, the issue that I really wanted to let you know and let your listeners know is that the area that I work in, that I specialise in, and I've been specialising since 2010, is anti-money laundering compliance. And under the anti-money laundering, legislation in New Zealand, privacy principles are strongly protected because of the need to. As under the anti-money laundering legislation, businesses must obtain very sensitive, private and confidential information from their customers or clients in order to understand or at least get reasonable belief that their customer is who they say they are. Then they also need to understand the nature and purpose of their business. So when a customer is being onboarded, a customer being a member of the public, is being onboarded in a business, they will be asked, for passports, driver licenses, bank statements, residential address, utility bills, source of wealth, source of funds, and all of that, and more. There's no ceiling, and if they don't like it, they can take their business elsewhere. But a business might also wrongly interpret that as being suspicious activity. So what the business then needs to do under the anti-money laundering legislation is to report to the New Zealand Police Financial Intelligence Unit, called the New Zealand Police FIU. And that's an arm of the New Zealand Police that is solely focused on AML, CFT. It's not an investigation agency, it's an intelligence unit. They receive these suspicious reports from the private sector and they action them. That's what the primary obligation is of the AML CFT, CFT being countering financing of terrorism. So the legislation, the AML CFT Act, puts in strong protection around government agencies not being able to access data that private businesses hold. But my knowledge from working in the industry, and I've had this knowledge for 3 years or more now, and I've tried to action about, my complaints, but it hasn't gone anywhere, is that I've learned that government agencies in New Zealand, who, when I say government agency, it could be just a government department that has a, some type of investigation unit. They have been using the AML CFT Act as a backdoor to get information, privacy information. But under the AML CFT Act, they're not entitled to it. So, this is quite clearly written into legislation, but it hasn't been recognised as the government as a matter that should be taken very seriously. And it is one of the greatest breaches of, humanitarian rights, international standards to breach privacy principles. And I'm, frustrated that the AML CFT Act is being abused by governments sometimes for sinister purpose, conflicts of interest not being managed. And, when I stood up for my clients, I'm not a lawyer, but I know how to interpret law. And when I stood up for my clients' rights, as far as legal obligations, and advised them that you're not allowed to give that privacy information to that government agency. It's not, it's not legally able to be done under the AML CFT Act. The Ministry of Justice then made some type of threat that, it needed to be done because it was the machinery of government, and it was the intention of the law for the law to be used that way. At the same time that the government's lawyer was writing to me and to my client, threatening to take us to court. Now, I would have been quite happy to go to court under a judicial review. I would have won it hands down, and I probably would have got myself a good profile, in the same time, to help the business. But the client's position was quite different, is that they didn't want to be offside with the government. They didn't want disruption to, their business. They didn't want the media or the public to misinterpret why they're in court under the AML CFT Act, challenging the government's access to privacy information from their client. And they didn't want the legal costs, and as we know, these cases go on for years and years. So it was a situation. Corruption again was winning in New Zealand, and it's still winning because we don't have a dedicated, independent anti-corruption agency. Winston Peters, who's the current Deputy Prime Minister, his political party, the New Zealand First Party, had it as a priority, if they were to get into government, to establish an independent anti-corruption agency. But with the coalition, those negotiations must have gone out the door, sadly. But, New Zealand's position it's deteriorating significantly when blatant breaches of, our Bill of Rights are happening and nothing's being done about it. There's no one in New Zealand I thought it would be the Governor-General. My understanding is that the Governor-General's role is to be the person that stands in between the public and the government to ensure that the public are not being oppressed by the government. And the Governor-General is appointed on behalf of the King or the Queen of the United Kingdom. But when I tried to contact the Governor-General just to share my information of my 10-year timeframe investigation, because I've revealed, I've identified a lot of wrongdoing in New Zealand government agencies, the Governor-General didn't think it was their position to meet privately with me, and that perhaps I should speak to the head of the SIS, which at that time was, or still is, I think, Mr. Luxon, the Prime Minister. And therein lays the problem, I said, because, incompetency. Talking about Mr. Luxon, I'm not here, I'm not poking fingers, but Air New Zealand, Mr. Luxon was the CEO of Air New Zealand for a number of years, and this country learned in recent times there was no proper security at Auckland Airport. And it was the police that discovered that when they were doing undercover surveillance and saw staff members who were not rostered to go onto the tarmac, going onto the tarmac and accessing cargo. Air New Zealand, security controls terrible. They could have been putting on bombs instead of drugs, So an anti-corruption agency would have the expectation that they identify all these weaknesses that allows corruption to happen, it allows crime to happen, it allows drugs to come into the country or to leave the country, which eventually gets into the community and into schools. If New Zealand could do the very basics of protecting the people, I think the country would be in a completely different state. But we've never, ever been anywhere close, I don't believe, to the government properly protecting the rights under the Bill of Rights that New Zealanders have.
Well, not to disagree with you per se, and I agree with what you're asserting there. However, the Bill of Rights Act has a section right at the end of the Bill of Rights Act that says, while we have guaranteed you all these rights, at some point there might be a justification for us to say you don't actually have any of these rights. All right. For example, when I got arrested for protesting lockdown peacefully, that's my right. But I still got arrested, and I'm a convicted criminal now. For I am guilty of the crime of standing within 2 meters of another person. Right? The government can just pass legislation 4 o'clock in the morning. It's a parliamentary sovereign dictatorship. No debate. Nobody's there, really. They rubber stamp it. They put it through. It starts getting enforced before it's even been gazetted. Right? And that's what's problematic about this little country here. As my former producer from American Freedom Radio, Mr. Mitch Santel, used to tell me, New Zealand is a small town pretending to be a country. And if you think of New Zealand, I define it as a extended retirement beach community. All right, that's if you want to really slow down, ladies and gentlemen, if you're tired of the hustle and bustle, you're tired of getting things done, you're tired of enthusiasm, come to New Zealand. We've got everything you're looking for.
Well, that's what the organised criminals think too, and that's why they're here. We've got certain attractiveness to the country that brings crime to New Zealand, and one of them is not having an independent anti-corruption agency. It's ridiculous that it's been shared with the Serious Fraud Office, and look at the statistics. There's nothing that gets done. So when you've got a success rate of between about a 95% chance rate of success as a serious fraudster to succeed in New Zealand, then of course we're going to get a lot of crime, financial crime coming to New Zealand, and that includes, the facilitation of narcotics. It can be human trafficking as well. Matters that we have to address.
I would agree with that. However, it's more specifically money laundering, as the Panama Paper leaks revealed. New Zealand was, I believe, mentioned in those leaks close to 66,000 times as a global centre for money laundering, much like the Cayman Islands. And the reason for this is, like the Cayman Islands, New Zealand is a former British banking colony. And this is why money laundering is allowed to come through here hand over fist, because that basically finances the world economy. As Michael C. Rupert from thewilderness.com relayed this to the US economy, take a look at the current US national debt. It's like trillions and trillions of dollars or whatever. In order to stop the economy from just grinding to a halt because it's so overburdened with debt. What you need is that nation's money supply to be fed with liquid cash. If there is cash in the system, you can keep being in debt for a significant amount of time. That cash flow stops, the debt becomes rigid, and the economy basically collapses. Now, how they do it in the United States is probably very similar to how they do it here. You do not have to explain where your money comes from. Like, if you or I, Kerry, go into a bank and put in 10 grand, we will be investigated and we will be asked, well, where did that money come from? But if you have a corporation listed on the United States Stock Exchange, you don't have to. So if you're the CEO of Coca-Cola and you have a friend who's a Colombian drug lord who wants 20 bulletproof Chevrolet Suburbans, you can give him all those vehicles and he can give you all this cash and you can just put it into your accounts and nobody is the wiser. And that allows that liquid cash to be going through the economy, because the reason why the Central Intelligence Agency has been pinpointed as probably one of the prime drug runners in the world is because the real job is to manage the US economy. 90% of directors of the CIA came to that office directly from Wall Street. This is how financial crimes essentially work, is a supply of liquid cash to keep that juggernaut of gravy train going.
Well, some of what you say is correct. In regards to listed companies, anti-money laundering laws consider that they have already got a level of governance, monitoring through the listed status, and therefore under AML laws, generally, they will have a less level of due diligence on the activities of a listed company. But you're quite right in saying that also could be abused and a weakness. And if you look at New Zealand's situation and our history of, being involved in the Panama Papers, and there's been others, the situation that New Zealand has as far as attractiveness to corporate fraud or money laundering is, the ease in which a company can be established and the cost of it. New Zealand was an easy country to set up a business, a company, a corporate veil. They get an incorporation certificate, a limited liability company, and they can do that within 3 working days and for under $200. And then when they've got a certificate, there was a time that you could register a company in New Zealand and operate as a bank, but don't have BANK in the title because that wasn't allowed. But you could have something similar in another language like Banco. And so then that company could be incorporated here in New Zealand, and that certificate used overseas to open up a bank account. And because New Zealand has that grand name of clean and green, which is a myth, is a perception, it has assisted to get those accounts operating all over the country, all over the world. And no, that's just some of our weaknesses. So when you work in the field that I work in to try and prevent crime, it's about procedures and controls and monitoring and oversight, governing, reporting. So if you're going to make it easy to conduct business in New Zealand, make sure you know who you're conducting business with. And that's what AML laws are all about. Who is your business? In New Zealand, you could register a company and you could have called yourself John Smith, Wilma Smith, or Donald Duck, and you would have been able to get through the registration because there was no identity verification. And that's the way that it still is today, I believe. I think there is more governing controls from the Register of Companies because New Zealand's been slapped on the hands quite a few times from international watchdogs, but we still have a lot of weaknesses. We still have a lot of attractiveness in New Zealand, and our main concern to me is the breaches of New Zealanders' Bill of Rights. And, we have to have governing structures that work to protect people. Without that, there's always going to be a mistrust between the people and the government. And, whether anything's going to change in the next few years, I don't see it happening. I mean, I'm not happy to see Judith Collins is at the top of the helm of this country, given her history, her acknowledgement that she leaked out personal information of a public sector who ended up getting a death threat and the police had to intervene. And now Judith Collins is head of this and head of that. She's the Attorney General, I think, isn't that right? And she's Minister of Defence. I don't know what other hat she's holding. But in my opinion, given her history of having failures and breaching conflicts of interest and committing the offence of leaking information out that caused someone to get a death threat, that should have automatically disqualified her completely from ever going back into Parliament. And for this country to have someone like that at the top is a clear sign that we're not dealing with issues of corruption.
Mm-hmm. And as I said at the protest, when somebody told me about when Judith Collins was being investigated, she was tossed out of Parliament. However, she could just go straight back in and become a member of Parliament again. And so I said, well, it's easy to be an MP when your soul is empty. And this country has a massive, and you've pointed this out to me in your emails, Kerry, systemic violations of privacy, systemic corruption, and systemic government failure to investigate themselves. And that is what makes New Zealand so attractive to organised crime. Come here and be one of us. We will make you feel at home. All right? This is paradise for criminals.
Well, isn't it? Yeah.
It's
transnational organised crime. We're a haven for it. Yeah. That's my opinion. Their statistics show that,
well, to back that up, I'm so sorry to interrupt here, but Penny Bright had words with a former corruption investigator of Scotland Yard who had worked in 40 countries. He told her in no uncertain terms, out of all the countries he's worked in investigating corruption, New Zealand is by far, he said, by far the most corrupt country in the world. And people in New Zealand are unable to qualify that or quantify that, and this is how corruption works. There are two types of corruption. There is top-down corruption, and then there is street-up corruption. Street-up corruption, you can bribe a police officer in Bali, for example, if he catches you with weed. Easy as pie, but you can't just bribe a New Zealand police officer if he catches you with some weed. But if you are a $1 million corporation, you can bribe the elected officials. This is what Penny Bright identified as the type of corruption that we suffer from primarily, which is called state capture. If the companies and criminal organisations are the ones that are financing and in some cases maybe even threatening or blackmailing your members of Parliament, the legislation that they put into action becomes a direct benefit for the corrupt interested parties. That's called state capture corruption, and that's what she identified as the primary reason for New Zealand's massive corruption debacle. And she also identified that the reason why we have a quote-unquote perception of being the least corrupt country in the world is because of Transparency International's corruption perception, key word there, index, which is a voluntary questionnaire. That means that if you send a voluntary questionnaire to a corrupt organisation, like for example the New Zealand branch of of that organisation, you have a look at the membership of it, and it's some of the most plutocratic, corrupt, oligarchical individuals in this country's history. So when Transparency International sends them a questionnaire, it works like this. So, bro, have you guys got any corruption going on there in New Zealand? And New Zealand goes, nah, bro, it's all G. It's all gonna be sweet as. And we are number one least corrupt country in the world on the Corruption Perception Index. It's just that simple. And people need to wake up to this fact People think that New Zealand is clean and green. We have 90%, and this is a very first groundwater study that has ever been conducted in this country, to my knowledge, happened in 2015, reported to me by Clyde Graff of the Graff Boys, who are 1080 poison advocates, and, disadvocates, I guess, when you're anti them. Anyway, 90% of our groundwater, that's the water that's underneath the ground. That's the stuff that you can get from bores and things of that nature. The planet's natural filtration processes, 90% of it is corrupted, all right? Battery acid, herbicides, pesticides, all sorts of residues and things of that nature are corrupting our very groundwater, and people don't realise this. So, if I may, ladies and gentlemen, if you know anything about New Zealand or think you know anything about New Zealand in terms of its level of corruption, I can assure you that it's only because of that particular vein that you've investigated. If you investigate finances in New Zealand, you'll find corruption. If you investigate the environment in New Zealand, you'll find corruption. If you investigate anything, basically, in this country that is happening in a systemic, hierarchical, organizational way, you will most likely find corruption. That's how bad it really is. They're so good at being corrupt that nobody knows that they're corrupt.
Vinny, can I just respond to a couple of points there?
Right ahead.
Yeah, just that last comment. That's right. I mean, corruption is something that is hidden, so therefore it's very rare that it's actually detected. Unless you're looking for it, you've got systems that are set up to detect it. You mentioned the Transparency International. I was formerly a member of the Transparency International, and whilst I was a member, I got some really good insight from how they operate, and a lot of what they do is actually available publicly. Transparency International New Zealand, tinz.org.nz. If you look at some of their, reports that they've distributed, you'll see that they are pushing, they have been pushing New Zealand for a long time to do more than what they're doing. And I think the Corruption Perceptions Index is actually quite helpful for understanding, maybe street corruption, like you mentioned earlier, as far as, a bribe being offered to the police. That type of corruption is not really something that would, I'm not aware of it being a common conduct of police at all in New Zealand, and I think if it was, we would probably hear about it.
If it was, I'd carry several grand on me at any point in time. But anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, so I mean, we know in other countries, that's expected when you're travelling through. If you get in trouble with law enforcement, accept that they're going to ask you for a bribe to get yourself out of trouble. So the Corruption Perception Index does have some benefits there, but the Transparency International has been telling government for a long time now that there needs to be more transparency in their decision making, and there needs to be a better governance control in New Zealand for managing corruption. I really don't think I've got much more to add to that. Just on the point of state capture, the state capture definition actually fits into the situation of what happened to Alan Hubbard and Aorangi Securities. The misconception of the public is that what happened to Alan Hubbard was all to do with South Canterbury finance. That's the first mistake that the general public have, is that what happened to Alan Hubbard going into statutory management had nothing at all to do with South Canterbury finance. The ground was based on Aorangi Securities, which after years and years and years of investigation by the government proved themselves eventually that they were wrong in the first place by saying Aorangi was insolvent. Aorangi had about 140 million in its account at the time, liquidity, and the investors who were meant to be victims were paid out. Almost 99, I think it's about 99 cents on the dollar, or, somewhere quite high like
between
that.
95 and 96 cents on the dollar, according to Paul Carruthers, who I had on the show many times during that era. But yes.
Yeah, no, I know Paul. He did a great job too. He was in the end banging his head against the wall, because the media reporters were tainted by their conflicts of interest. They were regurgitating information. Paul Carruthers knew exactly what was happening. He's one of a few people in New Zealand that knew what was happening. But the state capture, the government actually took those assets of Alan Hubbard's and the investors. They seized them without legal authority. So state capture includes when the government changes law to suit them in order to capture those assets or those values. And under the Statutory Management Act, to which the statutory management applied against Alan Hubbard, I think it was actually called the Corporation something or other Act, which is where the statutory management powers are. But the law was not made to be applied. Statutory management was not made to be applied to a private individual. It was to a corporation. And it was for when the circumstances were absolutely dire, and there was no other option but to seize assets, freeze everything, and bring everything to a halt. So that would only be done against a corporation, but not to a private individual. But the Securities Commission back at that time had some people making the decision-making who had conflicts, and they not only didn't deal with their conflicts of interest, but they also interpreted the law the way that they chose to, and said statutory management could be applied against a private individual. That matter should have only been decided by a high court, not by a group of 3 or 4 sitting around a table who had conflicts of interest that they weren't managing. So, I've got the opportunity here to say to your channel that the matter of what happened to Alan Hubbard, it was state capture of Alan Hubbard, with the target being South Canterbury Finance. The government wanted the assets, and the government didn't deal with their conflicts under the government guarantee. And they were buying and selling assets at the same time without having proper controls in place. And that's another story at another time. But that's just one example of the injustices in this country. The country then, and still is today, has not got any competent government agency or independent body for me to hand that evidence to. And the evidence I've got would put, I believe, a politician into jail, a senior politician. And my former background is in investigation, having cases in court, people convicted. I know how to put evidence together, and I don't have that tunnel vision. A document is a document is a document. And if I didn't create the document and it's come from an independent source, and there's no reason to doubt the authenticity of that document, then there's no reason not to accept what it says. And the documents I've got show there was a very serious, I'll call it a fraud and a corruption that happened. And we're talking a minimum of 100 million. That's just for that one act, the one fraudulent act. That's a minimum of 100 million. But then there's all the rest of it with the tampering of, falsely taking ownership of assets and then selling those assets without anybody in this country or any government agency having proper controls in place. We're a mess, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
Mess.
So with that, the Vinny Eastwood Show does like to benefit the listeners as much as we can. So if any of you who are involved with drug dealing, gun running, money laundering, fraud, corruption, and things of that nature, the Vinny Eastwood Show would like to invite you to New Zealand, so you can be home and have a 95% chance of never even so much as get investigated for your freaking corruption. All right, it's just
that's where you've got to have a sense of humour, because You either laugh or cry, and I'd rather laugh.
The person who came up with that saying allegedly was President Abraham Lincoln. After the Battle of Gettysburg, the bloodiest battle of the Civil War, a journalist was walking through Gettysburg and heard this laughter coming from one of the medical barracks where all these soldiers who had their legs and limbs blown off and things of that nature were roaring with laughter. And this journalist was very curious. So he went inside and found that it was the president who was sitting in the centre of the barracks making everybody laugh. This journalist was incensed. He said, "Mr. President, how can you be so jovial at a time of such agony?" And the president replied, "Because if I didn't laugh, I'd cry."
Right, that's very interesting. I didn't know that's where it originated from.
And the reason why we laugh instead of cry is because of a physiological connection with our brain. The three parts of the brain are the prefrontal cortex, that does our black and white thinking, our mammalian cortex, that does our feeling, and our reptilian cortex, that are down at the base of the spine, that does our action. Right? When you are, for example, if we were listening to this show and there were no jokes and there was no fun going on, after a little while, the prefrontal cortex shuts down and it becomes about the feeling, the emotion of what you're feeling. You're no longer thinking anymore. When you joke, on the other hand, and produce a laugh, the brain resets straight back into its analysis capability, black and white again. This is why it is so much easier to learn the truth of the world through the lens of comedy than it is through news and investigative journalism.
Very interesting. Yeah, I like that. It's positive energy, isn't it? I find myself doing that a lot. Helps to deal with stress. Either that or play the guitar.
Yes, and that's why after COVID it was extremely distressing for me, because I used to like getting together with my mates every weekend or second weekend, every time we could, to have a jam, make music and things of that nature. And after COVID, our lead guitarist went away and haven't been able to get a band together since, and I've just been missing out on all of that good music, and it makes me feel very, very sad sometimes when I think about it. Thank you very much, Kerry, for reminding me. Now, we are... this show is kind of like a bathtub. It doesn't really work without a plug. Do you have any wares or donations you would like to seek, or anything of that nature that you would like to promote before we close this show off? By the way, we've run well over time already, so I'm glad that all the listeners are still here with us at the moment. So, Kerry, go right ahead.
I'm just promoting New Zealand to have a independent anti-corruption agency. Until we do, I'm not going to rest. Yeah.
Is there a organisation, platform or website or something of that nature that people can go to maybe assist that, or maybe contact details so people who want to assist you can help that happen? Because one person by themselves can do a lot. This is true, but it's when people are working in cooperative, voluntary capacity that great things can really be accomplished.
Maybe I'll put a petition together, and if I do that, then I'll come back to your show and see if your listeners will be prepared to put a signature to it for New Zealand to get independent.
We'll see about
anti-corruption
that.
Agency.
Yeah. An anti-corruption agency for New Zealand. I don't see a whole lot of people financing that effort.
No, just the signature, for Parliament to act.
Yeah.
The government to act, just their signature. No money needed from them, just the signature.
Yep. But that's how Parliament acts, isn't it? That's why they're called acts, because it's a fraud and a lie. So that's the other thing about government. From the Latin governe, meaning to control, and mente, meaning the mind. If you believe that you need government, what you believe is that you need mind control.
You need governance. We don't need government, we need governance primarily. Mm-hmm. Governance should always be what stands out in government, and that's what I'm saying, is that there is no governance in government in New Zealand. in those key areas that affect justice, so, there's some basic things that are failing in New Zealand that shouldn't be failing. And I don't see any change ahead. There's nothing that's happening, The focus is on elsewhere, like the Minister of Police is focusing on not wanting people riding gang motorbikes to wear certain colours, but that's just tying up our police force personnel even more when they're already stretched. And, that doesn't really do anything to reduce crime. It actually worsens it as far as detection, when it's good really in some ways to see who's around. So long as they're driving around on their bikes, riding around on their bikes, and they're not committing crime, then I think they should be allowed to be. A lot of them seem to be established under a relationship of family members for support. So I think, that's another area that we're going wrong in New Zealand. I think that there's an over-focus of these motorcycle gangs. It's the white-collar criminals that we should be chasing, not the people driving around on motorbikes that are going about their way, let alone that they might be an eyesore and a bit of a hearing aid with their, motorbikes revving and roaring. But, I think that New Zealand's got it wrong in many different ways, and not having an independent anti-corruption agency is just aggravating all the problems.
Or rather, it's facilitating all those problems.
Yeah, that's right.
And secondarily, I believe I recall, I was just thinking about it the other day, actually, my interview with former Constable Buck Rains, and I explained to him the basic process of cult indoctrination. And this is where you get the police recruits isolated, and this could be with any cult, and they're isolated from their family. They become sort of like their own little family. They have meaningless tasks that they make them repeat over and over again to dull the mind. They don't have terribly great nutrition. There's a central doctrine that must be obeyed, central authority that must be obeyed, and to henpeck or rather ostracize anybody who speaks outside the prevailing wisdom of the cult. And I gave him those elements. He said, yeah, police training is a cult, bro. And I was just like, oh, that's what we're talking about here, is that people don't know that if you go to so much as primary school, those exact same techniques are being employed. And so everybody, almost, technically, is part of some kind of cult. That's why it's called culture.
Yeah. Hey, can I just, before I go, I know that you've mentioned this is extended beyond what we had thought, but, talking again about governance, and we've referred to policing a bit, and I think that's because it's an important topic in New Zealand about having trust between the community and the police. But, if you're going to be looking at a governance structure, a police law or, internal policy, whatever it might be, could simply be, if you see another police officer commit a crime and you don't report it, you're party to that crime and you lose your job. There has to be a culture of being proactive in preventing corruption. And if the culture lacks that completely, well, there is the problem. Police officers join the police because generally, they join the police because they want to help the community. And, we need to support them, and we need to, keep those police officers in their job that want to stay there. But as you mentioned at the start of the show, a lot of them leave because they don't like the culture. But, the situation of you take a police officer arresting somebody, and let's say the police officer, this is hypothetical, the police officer loses their temper and whacks somebody that they're arresting without it really being warranted. Now, at that time, if no one else has seen it, the police officer is aware they've just committed a crime, they've just committed assault. The person might be saying, hey, you just hit me, you've assaulted me, blah, blah, blah. And then what is likely to happen is that police officer, whether they be, male, female, could be looking at losing their job, could be even lose their marriage if the other side is upset with the loss of income, could lose a mortgage, could lose their reputation, standing in community. They've got a lot to lose, but all they have to do to avoid that loss is to say that person they're arresting assaulted them and resisted arrest. And this is an area that I've studied with the statistics. And if you look at the statistics of police claiming that assaults on police, a lot of them are thrown out in court. And I think that's an area in New Zealand that's not being properly governed. The police have to be able to conduct themselves according to law. And the difference, between self-defence and a crime of assault is quite clear. And if the culture in the police is to ignore those crucial problems, and let's not forget about the victims and, the families of the victims, has to be addressed, because until those issues get addressed, New Zealand, police not having a proper independent police conduct authority to protect the public, or at least to ensure the public's rights are upheld, there's always going to be mistrust between the community and the police. And it'd be good to see that removed, that mistrust, and it would be good to see the police and the community working together again, like it was back in the 90s when I was in the police. I think I was in the police at a good time.
Yes, Grace Hayden, former prosecuting sergeant, she echoed that during the early to mid 90s, New Zealand police weren't anywhere near as corrupt as they appear now, and she said that part of the reason for that massive increase in the corruption of it was, ironically, the newly introduced police fitness standards. What that meant is, if you're 40-something and you're not physically fit, but you're an incredible investigator because your job doesn't involve chasing people around in the street and jumping over fences and fighting with a club and stuff like that. No. Your job is to sit at a desk pushing papers around, making phone calls, conducting investigations. And what she found was, from personal experience, that a lot of those highly qualified people, those highly moral people, could no longer keep their job because they just weren't physically fit enough. And that was a big mistake. I think if you want to be on the front line and stuff like that, yeah, sure, I'm sure being fit helps. But because police college doesn't teach criminal psychology to police and doesn't teach psychology in general with how people are mentally ill, how to calm them down, how to mediate and things of that nature, how to de-escalate, those aren't things that are really readily, massively trained. I mean, Buck Rains told me that one time when they were having their presentation on cannabis, they were being taught by a person who wrote a book about cannabis in, I believe, 1973, and he was only lecturing them for an hour, right? 1 hour of total training on how cannabis is bad, and during that hour, for approximately 90% of it, according to Buck, he talked about the one time he went to Antarctica. All right, so we're not talking about people who are getting overly educated in terms of real human interaction, in terms of real crimes and things of that nature. So it goes downstream, and that's what we're dealing with. That's why we're picking up the pieces. That's why we can see reports from 3 News, I believe it was in 2015, of 1,023, I believe, police officers being prosecuted privately in the New Zealand court system for beating people up for no reason, stealing their stuff, damaging their stuff, lying, being corrupt, taking bribes, confiscating drugs and then smoking them themselves, so on and so forth. Out of those 1,023, 1,020 of them, the cases were thrown out. And of the 3 that the cases actually did proceed and get convictions, Neither of those 3 police officers moved their even lost their job. What they had to do is simply move the police station that they were working at. So that means it's 100% likely that if you're a New Zealand police officer in this country, and that was back then, and it's probably worse now, maybe it's 110% chance now, that if you do a crime, you ain't going to experience any real consequences for it if you have a badge. If the people who enforce the law are above the law, corruption is what you have, unfortunately. It's as you've pointed out, not only with the privacy violations, we're talking about a systemic thing, and I'm not saying that all police are bad in terms of they're real bad people. A lot of these are really well-meaning kids who actually do go into the police wanting to help their community, and they just get sucked into a cult. And a lot of them, they get so traumatized during the course of their job that they have to drink significant amounts every night just to be able to sleep. And it was soldiers, former New Zealand soldiers, that taught me the answer to this question when they said that they'd killed 3 people or 40 people, as one of the much elder soldiers who was part of the Māori battalion told me. That is why they drink. That's why we drink, Vinny, because if we don't black out drunk every night, then the ghosts come. And that's what happens when you are involved in any organization that makes you or allows you to do immoral things. If you have a conscience, your conscience won't let you sleep well.
It's interesting, yeah. The police need, officers with life skills, so that they have the ability to know how to deal with any situation. Well, probably not any situation, but with most situations that that's presented in front of them. Having life skills is, a benefit. But the culture that that any organisation, whether it be the police or any organisation, operates under is led from the top. They call it the top-down approach. Happens at the top and it feeds all the way down to the bottom. And if that culture is missing from the top, then it will never get down to to the street level or to the ground level. There has to be it's potentially like a full restructure of leadership, because if the leadership is failing, then it's the leaders that need to change. And in New South Wales, I think also in Queensland, they had a Royal Commission of Inquiries or similar for police corruption, and it ended up with a full restructure of the leaders. There was someone appointed from the UK police force came over, I think, to the Queensland force, and had a big clean up. And that's, I think, something that will have to eventually happen in New Zealand. Is a leadership change and policies that operate well. Because until we get transparency of trust, then we're always going to have problems. And I think we all would rather live in a community that gets on well together.
Yeah.
Look after thy neighbours.
Yeah, and that's the what the Chinese say, a fish rots from the head. Now, what that saying means is, if you see an organisation and that organisation is doing bad things, don't look at the people on the street. Don't look at the McDonald's person who's serving you the bad burger. Look at the CEOs. Look at the people who are actually in control of those organisations, and that is where you will find the rot is coming from, and the rot trickles down.
That's right. I agree. Yeah, it's like in government departments, if we look at New Zealand's situation, it's the CEOs that are really the ones that are more responsible for that government as opposed to the minister, because the CEO has more operational control. The minister is being fed information from the CEO. So, yeah, it's a management. It always comes down to management. And I just stress governance. Governance is transparent, and if there's no transparency in governance, then it's not happening.
Yeah.
You can assume it's not happening. Yeah.
Yes.
Vinny, thank you so much for having me on your channel.
Thank you.
My stomach's telling me I've got to go and get some lunch.
Okay. Well, just before you go, I saw a comic strip one time, and a little boy's going up to his dad who's reading the newspaper, and the little boy says, "Dad, I want to get into organised crime." The dad looks down from his newspaper and he goes, "Government or private sector?"
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, well, that's what a lot of people think. They make their decision, don't they? Which side am I going to work on? Where do I make the most money?
Yeah. I remember I talked to, very last thing, a guitarist from 8 Foot Sativa, and we came up with the idea for a t-shirt. It says, "In the battle between good and evil, some will choose good, some will choose evil, but most will sit on the fence to see who comes out on top. We are just trying to burn that fence down." People, you have to choose. It's good or evil. And as George Orwell said, if there's a lesson to be learned from this possible nightmare future that he wrote in 1984, it is this: don't let it happen. It's up to you.
Desmond Tutu has said, I hope I get it right, if you are neutral in corruption, then you are on the side of the oppressor.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you've got to prevent corruption. You've got to be active in doing so, not ignore it, because that's actually facilitating it.
Yeah. It's just like any kind of abuse, meaning used wrongly. Kerry Grass, this has been I think maybe 12 times as fantastic as I thought it was going to be. I'm sorry, I was in a bad mood before the show today. Just a bit of sleep deprivation and whatnot. It got me thinking like, oh, I'm not sure if I'm going to enjoy this interview. But it was actually maybe one of the best shows we've ever done in the 16 years of rolling this little bandwagon here. And that is all due to you, your awesomeness, your expertise, and your calm demeanour. And I am extraordinarily grateful. Kerry, thank you.
Thank you, Vinny. I think you're wonderful as well. We work well together. Maybe I'll be invited back again.
Yep, I'll tell you what, you just invite yourself.
Hey, thank you for that open invitation. I might take you up on that.
You're welcome, Kerry. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen. We'll have to let Kerry go here while we close up the show. Thank you so much. All right, and cheers, guys. I would like to invite you to head over to the VinnyEastwoodShow.com. That's Vinny with a Y, because it's the most important question. And Eastwood, like, go ahead. Make my news. And go ahead, ladies and gentlemen. This show has been exposing corruption and giving a platform to people like Kerry. You know, I think this is the 4th former police officer, New Zealand police officer that I've had on the show. Maybe the 10th total former police officer from the UK and United States, respectively. And I always love these particular interviews. It's just been great. And if you want to have a look for interviews with Constable Buck Raines, BuckRaines, you will not be able to find it because it got deleted off of YouTube. Damn it! And I cannot find the video, but it was like it was an unbelievably candid, awesome interview. And this work has been going on for quite some time, guys. If you're fighting for freedom, it's not a weekend retreat. It's not a seminar. It is your life force. That's what freedom means to me. It means life. Tyranny to me means death. The death of your conscience, the death of your soul, the death of your mind, your intelligence, your courage. That's what tyranny means to me. And that's why freedom it means so much to me. You know, I thought about it the other day, that it's so important to really feel like freedom is important, because all the good things in life flow from that belief. Your health, both physically, mentally, your finances. Have a look at how much corruption takes from you and I on a daily basis. How much extra things cost. I mean, have a look at inflation, for example. I remember when I was a kid, gas in New Zealand, what was that, like 20 cents a litre or something like that in the mid-90s? I can't freaking remember. But now it's nearly $3 a litre. And that's not necessarily because the gas has gotten more expensive per se. It's because the amount of money that we print has become so voluminous that all the money that we got is worth almost nothing by comparison to how much it was. So that's a hidden tax. Everything we have, because of corruption, because of tyranny, gets taken from us every day. Every day. That tyranny continues. That we don't fight for freedom. You have to fight for it rather than fighting it. Every day that it continues, people lose more and more and more things that are important to them. And I have this song lyric that one day the only job that will be left will be taking things from people who've got nothing left to give. So folks, I want to just please, I'm gonna say pretty please with a cherry on top, go to the VinnyEastwoodShow.com. That's Vinny with a Y because it's the most important question. And Eastwood, like, go ahead, make my news. And there you can find all the latest shows, my music as well, the Vendetta's music. And I would like you, if you can, please, guys, donate to the Vinny Eastwood Show. Set up an automatic payment on an ongoing basis so that this show can continue. Because without that continued fight, without the presence of this show in the way that it is conducted, the thousands upon thousands of guests that I've had over the years, I've produced more content than any alternative media organization in this country's history ever will. Okay? I can say that quite confidently. And the reason I can say that is because I can back it up. I've got 15 really big hard drives full of archives of this show with some of the most amazing people you've ever heard of. Look, if I may give you a recommendation, if you go to the VinnyEastwoodShow.com and you use the search bar at the top there, you can look for basically any guest. But I recommend listening to that David Icke and Mark Passio show where we talked about courage and consciousness, and that was conducted directly after the Wellington protest was brutally and savagely just bam, 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 destroyed by the very corrupt and very conscienceless New Zealand police. That was a very important show, probably maybe the best show I've ever done, and if you haven't seen it yet, I'd highly recommend you go look for it, either on my website or on my BitChute channel or something. A lot of people stole that interview. All right, just stole it because it was so good. It was too good not to steal. And they've gotten, I think, it's quite funny actually. I'll produce content and I might get, X amount of hits or whatever it is, but might be thousands, might be 100,000 or something. But then I'll find later that somebody has taken it and uploaded it and given it a different title or whatever, and they'll have 10, 20, even 100 times the amount of hits that I get because of that. And I could be pissed off that I'm not getting those hits, but I'm not. If you liked this show, this episode, steal it! Okay? You have my permission. Steal it. Re-upload it. Hey, claim that it's yours even. It doesn't matter. As long as people are watching it, listening to it, that's what's important. Don't let that opportunity to steal something Vinny Eastwood made pass you by. Like, seriously, just go and download the hell out of it and make your own following. That's probably going to be a lot bigger than mine because I'm concentrating on producing the show rather than marketing it. You guys can market it yourselves, and I probably won't get any benefit from it, not directly, but mankind benefits from it. And I know some of you might be thinking, oh, but Vinny, nobody will be convinced. People will give me crap about if I'm putting that on my channels and stuff like that. Yes, you're right. David Icke told me that you can't convince anybody of anything. But you can tell them things that they cannot unhear.
Gentlemen, I brought you here to discuss the Eastwood problem. It may be necessary to penetrate the Vinny Eastwood show. The Vinny Eastwood show. Yeah, that's what I said.
Well, I've been working on a new Vinny scene. I think that might be the kind of penetration we need.
The Vinny Eastwood show. Sundays, 3 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. Live on Ground Zero Radio.
Welcome, ladies, gentlemen, and hermaphrodites. My fellow slaves of the global plantation. The Vinny Eastwood show is bad news. It's like the news, but so much worse. It's the lighter side of genocide. Just because we're being exterminated doesn't mean we can't enjoy it. Otherwise, what's the point of being killed? The Vinny Eastwood show, where the only thing worse than living in a high-tech global police state run by child trafficking Satanists is Vinny's jokes.
You see, this beastly, ghastly show has been exposing our scumbaggery, which we call necessary.
Yeah, and as the World Economic Führer, I believe we should give him a little gift with a little card that says Merry Christmas from Santa Claus.
Oh, yeah, we could send something through his windows. Yeah, I've been speaking with Jacinda Ardern that we need to eliminate the threat of Vinny Eastwood.
Why do you say Vinny Eastwood when it's clearly Vinny Eastwood? Absolutely, he's a major impediment to our planet. How are we going to get rid of him?
We could poison his water supply.
We've done that already.
Okay, I'm running out of ideas here. I'm sorry, I've got a lot going on. Klaus Schwab Jr. telling people that I'm some evil overlord.
Oh, that's just not true. You see, we're lifetime actors.
Yes, we play the role, don't we?
But I am still glad, even if I am not really the overlord, that I have penetrated all the cabinets of the world. Penetration is big for me.
Oh, it's big for me, too. I wouldn't be me if it weren't for the copious quantities of penetration.
Yeah, so thank God my mother's out of the way. Otherwise I never would have been king. Just keep to go on and on. You know, the stress of dealing with this Vinny Eastwood problem is probably what killed her. I mean, she was a very young 96, you see.